So when I've made videos on this subject before, they've never got a huge amount of traction, and I think it may be that there's simply not that many boxing fans among my subscribers. But this is something that I am interested in, and I've always taken the approach of just talking about the things I'm interested in. So we'll see how it goes anyway. Um, Boxing is a sport that has long fascinated me for probably a quarter of a century now, at least since the end of the 20th century, I've had some interest in the sport. Now, I'd be lying if I say I'm a super fan. I don't follow every fight religiously. I don't follow the sport religiously, and there will be quite long gaps where I kind of am distracted by other things and I'm focusing on other things. But then it always comes back to me in some capacity. Maybe it's a particular fight, maybe it's particular boxing news, but somehow it always comes back, and then I'm once again focused on it. So I thought this would be just an interesting opportunity to talk about, hopefully not too long, what I feel are the pros and cons for me of the sport. A very quick little bit of background. I've done a little bit myself. I've trained in a boxing gym and I had one amateur fight, which I didn't win. That's the extent of my experience, but it's not non-existent. I've had a little bit of insight into that world. Very limited. I'm under no illusions it's limited, but it was an experience. Now, I lost because I wasn't sufficiently defending myself. It was white collar boxing, it was amateur level. Um, the guy didn't hurt me at all. I can honestly say that, but basically, I wasn't sufficiently defending myself. My guard was down. The referee had to act, and he was right to do so. I mean, it was foolish of me. And yeah, I just wasn't. He could see my punches coming, put it that way, because I was advertising them too soon. I've seen the footage myself. My brother recorded it, and I made some fundamental mistakes, but also breathing issues because I think I overexerted myself in the build-up, and so that's the thing at that level you get to kind of, because it might be most people who do white collar boxing will only do it once, maybe twice in their life, so that's the big moment. Of course, it was disappointing to lose, but if it's a choice between having a fight and losing or doing nothing, definitely I choose the former. I was in a boxing ring, I had a fight, and that's what happened. Anyway, um, I don't really have space in this video to talk about everything I want to talk about, so I'm just going to basically outline it. I'm going to start off by the pros, the likes, and then the dislikes, and I'll try and make this as condensed as possible, so bear with me. Likes, well, history. MMA just doesn't compete with boxing in terms of history, in terms of the overlap you get with social issues. I mean, for example, the wins of Jack Johnson at the turn of the 20th century. When you look at the racial dynamic of that era, Jim Crow in the United States, basically when he won fights over race riots. Now, that's a dark aspect of the past, but it's also a very interesting part of history, and it's boxing lends itself to social history more than maybe any other sport, except perhaps football in the UK, perhaps baseball in the United States. But boxing has a particular role in society. Traditionally, it's been seen as a working class sport, of course, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, there were often wealthy patrons, royal patrons, and it's just boxing has a fascinating social history, actually, much more than people realize. And I've always found that interesting. It also means that there's more history, more fighters, more fights to discuss. There's that aspect. Um, I think that it pushes a man to really, really test himself. And yes, women do it as well. I don't want to exclude that. But, you could say that of any physical sport, I guess. But it really does. I mean, there's nothing quite like facing another man in front of thousands of people. And it's, some say boxing's barbaric, it's hitting people for money, but there's more to it than that. It's about self-discipline. It's about, every fighter will say this. Yes, there is a violent side to it. Of course there is. But a lot of fighters will say, my opponent is my opponent for this fight, but It's about myself. It's about a man pushing himself to the limits. Now, there's other ways to do that. You could climb a mountain, you could go on some marathon. I'm not saying there isn't other physical tests, but not in the same way against another competitor, not quite like that. And, I don't think any other sport is like that. Maybe other martial arts, but not. It's basically, there's no exaggeration in saying they're basically modern day gladiators without the deliberate death, you know, and that's something that's, even my fight, there was about 600 people in attendance, and you could feel the adrenaline going. Now, I can't imagine what it's like stepping into a ring when you have 90,000 people watching, as in Joshua versus Klitschko, or 80,000 with the Froch Groves fights. I mean, that's incredible. And the other thing I like about the sport is, and then knowing that you've done that, even if you don't win, I know at professional level fighters set themselves different targets, but that's quite something. Another thing I like is rankings. No sport really lends itself to rankings in the same way. I mean, I know in football there's the Premier League and Super League and all that sort of thing. Is that the right word? You see, shows how much I know about football. But my little nephew's really into football. He's taught me a few things. But um, boxing really lends itself to, like, who are the top 10 heavyweights, who are the top 10 welterweights of all time. Those sort of questions. The great thing about it is there's no right or wrong answer, and it's so flexible, and it's endlessly flexible because you can make lots of arguments for or against, and that's very interesting. I enjoy taking part in those sort of debates and justifying the reasons. It's like discussing films or discussing other things, but to me, no sport really lends itself that way. I mean, I don't think we see, for example, people discussing the top 10 tennis players of all time to the same extent, to the same sort of, you won't get any debates like boxing debates in that sense. So I think it's very interesting and engaging. Now I come to the negative side, because there is. This is why there's times I don't love the sport. I'd be lying if I said I always did. There's times I really dislike some aspects of it. Um, the mudslinging and pettiness between fans, it can be pathetic sometimes. This is particularly noticeable for the Mayweather Pacquiao fight in 2015, before and after. I mean, it just gets to the point of, you get into racial and homophobic slurs, both sides. I have to say the Pacquiao side is a little bit more. Well, they both do it, but the Pacquiao side, frankly, some of those guys need to move on. It was 9 years ago now, almost. So it's just, to get to the point of hating an athlete because you disagree with a decision is absurd. I mean, Timothy Bradley got a lot of abuse from Pacquiao fans because of a controversial decision, to the point where he was actually getting death threats. Now that's outrageous to do that to an athlete, because you don't like a decision. But also the disrespect fans show each other. It's just, that's something I've no time for. I understand that people get passionate and they want to argue their case, but you get nationalistic bias as well, particularly, like, say, if there's a fight between a Mexican Puerto Rican, between the US and the UK, to a lesser extent, you get that sort of nationalism involved, and that can sometimes, you know, when it's measured, it's just okay, it's a loyalty, it's patriotism, but it can get out of hand to be quite jingoistic and unpleasant. And if you're, supporting a fighter just because he's the same nationality or the same race, I would suggest that you're being very close-minded. Um, and I have to say, some British boxing fans, they're like our football hooligans. They behave that way. They could be very jingoistic and embarrassing in their behaviour, towards fighters from other countries. I've seen it. I don't want to exaggerate the problem. I'm not suggesting it's everywhere, but it happens, and it has happened. I remember some David Hay fans behaved that way to the Klitschko fight, and I was embarrassed because I have huge respect for Vladimir Klitschko. Not only is he a great fighter, but he's a gentleman, and he did not deserve that. But I don't want to exaggerate. I'm just saying it's sometimes noticeable. Um, and that's why, frankly, I want Alexander Usyk to beat Fury, because I'm tired of Fury's mouth. I'm tired of his disrespect to opponents. But yeah, that aspect, it can be depressing, and sometimes it gets out of hand. There's been a few fights where riots have broke out. There's been fights where fans didn't like a particular decision. I remember when Andrew Gallotta left the Tyson fight. Now, on one hand, it was unprofessional for a boxer to just leave the ring basically before the fight had really started. But Gallotta knew that something was seriously wrong, and he basically decided he didn't want to be permanently disabled. Now, I don't know what to make of that, but basically, if you saw that fight or the footage of it, it was quite unsettling because a big portion of the crowd basically pelted him with projectiles, all sorts of crap. And it's, that's just, you would not get that in tennis or in other sports. So, this things like that, people can think boxing's barbaric. I don't like it. Um, Another thing that I dislike is, boxing's dangerous. There's no point glossing it over. And even with improved rules, in the end of the day, a sport where you're hitting people on the head, there's dangers involved, and they'll always be there. Now, fighters choose those risks. They know the risks. Even in my amateur fight, I had to sign a disclaimer saying I knew the risks involved. Um, the sad reality is sometimes fighters do die in the ring, and sometimes they are permanently disabled. They get brain damage. They get now that's depressing. There's no way around it. That is depressing, and I don't know how it can be completely 100% prevented against. Boxing will always have danger, and maybe that's the appeal. But, unless only a heartless fan would want to see a fighter die or be permanently hurt because of, for the sake of entertainment. That's why sometimes, referees end a fight early and they get abused for it. But if they make the wrong decision and the fight goes on too long, then you have it's a choice between, okay, maybe a fighter doesn't really need to be stopped and he can go on to win. Okay, that's denying an opportunity. But the alternative is the referee could be saving his life if the referee genuinely feels he's taken too much abuse, so too much punishment. So there's no glossing that over. It's depressing, and hopefully the less that happens, the better. But unfortunately, boxing will always carry that risk. Um, so that's a sad reality. It's like a firefighter knows when he or she goes into a burning building, there's risks involved. Police officers know there's risks involved. Boxing is a dangerous profession. Um, and the final thing I don't like is corruption. Now, I don't know to what extent this problem exists because sometimes fans will allege corruption when they simply don't agree with a decision. But it would be naive to say that there isn't decisions made for the wrong reasons or backroom deals. Certainly in the past, the mob had a big influence on boxing. It was rotten, where they'd pressure a fighter to take a fall, things like that. So that side of it, it is very disheartening for a young fighter getting into the sport, where, for example, in the Olympics or even in the amateur scene, where decisions are made very controversially and they've clearly been the wrong decisions. It's not in of itself proof of corruption, but sometimes you do get bad judgments, and that's disheartening for fighters. And it's unfair on fans as well who've paid money, So I don't like that side. But all in all, I mean, you can see the gloves up there. They're actually the gloves I trained with. They're not fighting gloves; they're training gloves. But I have a lot of boxing movies. I've followed the sport for years. I've literally hundreds of boxing magazines. So the interest is always there. But that's what I see as the pros and cons. Now, if you do happen to be a boxing fan, let me know what you think. And if you're not and you want to ask me any questions, then go ahead. Thanks for watching.